ladies trying to come up on their roof, and a lady who's 8 months pregnant trying to climb up through a manhole to escape. The stories are horrendous. So when we think about what those people have been through and some of the issues for them, we're looking at something very current for us, real. So Danny, my guess is as a counsellor, therapist, somebody who works with all types of people and right across the lifespan, mental health issues are going to be a pretty regular part of what you deal with, and particularly anxiety. And our understanding is that anxiety can be pretty debilitating. It can be something that can be mild, but can also take us to the extreme. And I guess you've seen all of those.
Yes, I have. Anxiety presents in many ways, and it can be something that is quite mild, such as some butterflies in the stomach, all the way through to symptoms that are very debilitating and that completely overwhelm us and overpower us. And what I want to say is that most of us have experienced anxiety at some point. Sitting up at the front here creates a certain amount of anxiety for me, or whatever it might be. Most of us have had episodes
facing a test,
yes, that's
going
right.
For a license,
yes,
learning to drive, all that sort of thing.
All of that we would call normal anxiety. So all of us experience some level of apprehension, but then there's the sort of anxiety that's on the continuum that interrupts our life to various degrees.
So when we talk about a continuum, we're talking about this spread right across from mild anxiety, everyday kind of stress, expressed in anxiety, right through to debilitating. Danny, is there any, I guess when we think about general anxiety versus clinical anxiety, so if you as a counsellor have somebody who presents with anxiety, why don't we just reflect, what do you see, what do you observe, what do you feel that allows you to say this is an anxiety issue? Can you just list some of those things? Mate?
Yeah, because anxiety is something that we use in our everyday language, and in some ways it's a general term. However, it's also a clinical term. So some people will come to me and they have a level of anxiety which is real and that is impacting their life and that is intruding on their life, making things tricky. They may not meet what we call the markers or the criteria for an actual clinical diagnosis. So if you go to a psychologist or a doctor, they have particular cutoff points that you'll experience certain symptoms over a certain period of time, for example, 2 weeks. And it's only once you hit those definitions that you get an official diagnosis. But I guess what we wanted to say today, Traff, was there is this big spectrum of anxiety, and clinical anxiety doesn't capture all of these other experiences that people have that still affect your mental health, still are anxiety, but they're not officially diagnosed.
Okay. So someone could be not they haven't gone to a doctor, they haven't gone to a psychologist or psychiatrist, those people helpers, but they still maybe experience quite significant anxiety. They might prefer to hang on to that. There might be some reason why I don't want to go there, but they can be experiencing some pretty severe stuff. But if they do go to a psychologist, you're saying there's some indicators where they say this is clearly anxiety.
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And generally, Danny, is that from your experience in the research, is anxiety something that is hereditary? Is it something that I get because grandma had it and my mum had it and now I've got it, or through the male line, or is it more something in the environment?
We've just lost our notes for a minute. I'll turn that back on in a second. It is both. So yes, the research shows that with anxiety, there's a certain genetic component. It is in our genes and it's passed on from our relatives, but that's not the whole story. It has a lot to do with our environment. And in fact, scientists nowadays, with a fancy term called epigenetics, say that the environment reacts with our genes. So there's a real crossover and an interaction. It's not just genes, it's also our environment, which is encouraging because it's in the environment that we can change things, right?
Okay.
If it was just genetic, we would feel like we're predestined.
We're stuck.
We're stuck. But knowing that there are environmental factors means that we can change our circumstances.
Okay. So we can't just blame grandma or the town in which we live. It's going to be a bit of a combination generally, how they sort of all come together and factors. What about, there does seem to be some suggestions that when it comes to gender, women seem to be a little bit more vulnerable with mental health issues, particularly anxiety. What's the research on that, Danny? What's behind that?
Yeah, it does show from the stats that women seem to experience anxiety more than men. And I don't know whether there's any conclusive evidence or research. It might be that women are more empathetic and women tend to feel more than blokes do.
Mm-hmm.
And so that could create extra levels of anxiety. There's also evidence that women tend to be the caretakers and the nurturers in our society. So when it comes to anxiety around relationships, they might feel the burden, the responsibilities of relationships more than men. But the stats indicate it's more prevalent in women.
So I know in the loneliness literature, and being lonely has profound effects on our physical health. There's been some quite research over the last 10, 15 years into the issue of loneliness. And research says that women tend to convey or pass on a sense of loneliness more than men, maybe again because women treasure those relationship connections, and they sit around and have coffee together and say, I'm terribly lonely. And the other lady says, yes, now that I think about it, I might be too. And I don't wish to be unfair. That seems to be something, but loneliness has the same impact, or has the impact on our health the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And they reckon every cause of death has some component of loneliness. So there's been some huge discoveries about being lonely, and my guess is, Danny, it would be very difficult not to think that terribly lonely people aren't experiencing levels of anxiety.
Yeah, totally.
I'm sure they have to be together.
Yeah.
So we've got a little bit more there. Long-term, short-term, is there some kind of measure in mental health / anxiety? There might be short-term expressions of anxiety, but long-term could also be very real. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So some people might have an episode of anxiety that only lasts a short period of time, and then they may never experience anxiety again. Though most people that have episodes of anxiety are more likely to experience a subsequent episode of anxiety. Then there's chronic conditions. So people will experience anxiety regularly, and they will experience it fairly consistently throughout their life. So if someone is afraid of social settings, what we term social anxiety, in nearly every social setting, they will experience a degree of social anxiety, regardless of the context.
Okay, so they're going to be reluctant to go shopping, to the movies, to the restaurant, because that whole social thing is so real for them, the fear of social connection.
Yeah, yep, they're going to be avoidant of those situations.
Which has a huge impact on, which we need to talk about soon, the impact on relationships and that. So, Danny, when we think about, you've mentioned social anxiety, is there another kind of category that comes to mind? What's another category that would emerge?
For sure, there's quite a few types of anxieties, and social anxiety is one. Obsessive compulsive disorder, which means people that become very locked onto doing certain routines or focused on certain behaviours. There's something called general anxiety disorder, which may not relate to any specific context or situation, but people still experience anxious symptoms. So that is the most common one, is a generalised anxiety.
I remember talking to a lady where she would jump in the car with her husband to go somewhere, and it wasn't too far along before she'd say, I need to go back and check that I've locked the door. And it became had to go back and check and lock the door. And it became really an interference in their life. She just got so anxious about, did I lock the door? But the obsessive compulsive can act out in certain ways of putting shoes or washing hands. The whole ritual kind of thing has to be performed before they feel they can move on. So again, that's a part of anxiety, or anxiety is a part of that.
Yeah, the scientists have found there's this part in the brain that when we complete an activity, there's a little chemical kickback that says we're done, we're complete. But with people that experience obsessive compulsive, that's never finalized. So they just go, their brain goes around and around in a loop, and they feel they have to keep completing the task because it's not enough or it's not completed.
Okay. That again has to have some profound impacts on relationships. That's amazing. So for long term, so let's think about, we've mentioned one's symptom, if you like, and that's the butterflies in the stomach. I think we get palpitations, our heart, we get heart palpitations, sweating, difficulty breathing, headache.
Yeah.
What else, Danny? They'd be the main ones, wouldn't they? Breathing, we get tight chested, sweaty, heart races. So they can be some physical expressions of anxiety.
They're definitely the physical ones. And they're the ones we know because of adrenaline pumps through our system, and it has certain reactions, which are tight chest or pumping heart or sweaty palms or forehead, even tingling in your limbs. But there are a whole lot of other reactions. So there are what we call behavioural reactions. We talked about the obsessiveness of doing certain things. But when there are fear responses, people tend to run away. So there's a lot of avoidant behaviour, such as staying at home, not going out to the shopping centre, or being very reluctant to engage in a conversation with someone or go to a workplace. So there's the avoidant behaviours. And then there's a whole lot that goes on in our head. We might call this self-talk, but a whole lot of thoughts that also roll around with the anxiety about, I can't go there, that's too dangerous, I need to avoid this place. So it's like a little narrative that's also rolling around in our mind.
And my guess, again, that's going to vary a bit on intensity, but for some people, the extremes, that's going to be incredibly intensive. It's a loud speech going in their brain, which must interfere powerfully with being able to focus on different tasks and getting things done when that speech is so loud in their head. Then think about across the lifespan, when we start as adolescents and go right through to old age. What's the deal? What's the research tell us about anxiety across the lifespan? As I think about with you, it sounds like anxiety just doesn't fit this section here. It's pretty well for everybody. So we have adolescents who have anxiety. Some kids, I know they won't do exams. They just get to exams and just freeze. And they can do great schoolwork, but they just don't handle exams. Yeah. So it's an issue for adolescents.
Yeah, even a little bit younger, Trav. There are some kids at primary school age that have anxiety about going to school. I had a little niece start school this year. I don't have kids of my own, and I've been watching her over the last few weeks trying to acclimatise to going to school. And some days she's got a stomach ache, and some days she's got something wrong with her leg, and some days she's got something wrong with her left ear because she's anxious about going to school. Now, we would say that's normal. For some kids, though, that anxiety continues, and even through the primary years, they have this fear about attending school. It is more prevalent, and it often shows up in adolescence because our brain goes through a restructure, it goes through a whole pruning process in our adolescent years, and a lot of mental health issues surface at this stage, and anxiety is one of them. But as you said, it's not just adolescents. It can be young adults at university, and I have counselled young people at university. It can be young adults getting married or starting jobs. And then when children come on the scene for some people, all through the lifespan, middle age, when people are made redundant or their marriages break up or their kids leave home, and then into old age as well. So this is the thing, it spreads right across the spectrum.
And it was even for retired people and people facing end-of-life issues. It's got to be very real. I was just this week, I saw a little video clip, Danny, of a client who went to therapy because he was very anxious about his wife about to give birth to a baby, and he was wondering why. He was genuinely experienced a lot of anxiety about that. And under care, it became known that for 3 generations, every mother had lost the first child for 3 generations, and one of the mothers lost the first baby and 2 following twins. And he was sort of wondering, why am I anxious about this? So it was very real for him and his wife about to give birth. But I guess people stepping into retirement, losing their jobs, this is right across the board. Yeah,
the major transitions in life is an opportunity for anxiety to rear its head.
And my guess is